people are very bad judges of knowing if something's working. Why? Because when they first hear that it's not their fault, their divorce is not their fault, they're getting fired isn't their fault, they feel that's it. It's because of my bipolar disorder. It's because of my trauma. And they will always feel like, wow, that was so great that now I know.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Carabell, the founder of the Progress Network, joined, as always, by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And What Could Go Right is our weekly podcast in conjunction with the Progress Report, which is also part of our weekly podcast that looks at the news and some news that you can use, some news that you might not have noticed. But What Could Go Right is our main aspect, as well as our newsletter, which is free, which you can sign up for at theprogressnetwork.org. We're going to look today at a best-selling book that has called attention to a emerging trend, particularly in the United States, of how kids are exposed to therapy and the drugs that are prescribed as a result of those therapeutic regimes. And to the degree that we may be creating for our children a generation that is less resilient and less able to deal with the challenges of being alive, all in the name of trying to help them deal with the challenges of being alive. And that in the fear of all the challenges and problems, we have made decisions far more likely to make those fears true than to ameliorate them. So that is going to be our discussion today. Emma, who are we going to talk to?
We're going to be talking with Abigail Shrier. She's the author of 2 best-selling books, one that was met with a not insignificant amount of controversy, and that was Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. We're going to talk to her today about her recent book, which is a bestseller, called Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. All right, let's go find out why the kids aren't growing up. Are you ready?
I am. Abigail Shrier, thank you so much for joining us today for What Could Go Right. Your book, Bad Therapy, has been, to say that it has been in the news is an understatement. It has been the news in many ways. So for those who have not been tuned into the book and your thesis, and I know you've now at this point, it's like when you show up at work or school or wherever you are with a cast the first time, and everybody goes, oh my God, what happened? And by like the 70th time, you're so tired of the question and that you start making up stories. So I know that you've been asked the question about what your basic thesis is so many times at this point that you could either recite it in your sleep or it bores you to tears. That being said, just for the sake of our current conversation, please do so.
Okay. Well, first of all, I love the way, let me just say, I love the way you said that, because that is the crux of the problem, is that we settle into these orthodoxies without ever looking at them and saying, have we gone too far? Is this totally correct? Is it correct for everyone? And my book addresses one orthodoxy. And the orthodoxy is that the mental health catastrophe of the rising generation, it does seem to be a bit of a catastrophe. Young people are unhappy in numbers we haven't seen. They describe themselves as lonely, as anxious, as depressed, and they seem to be manifesting that. We have, everything from suicidal ideation to suicide attempts are up. They seem to be in genuine distress, this so-called Gen Z or the, rising generation. And the question is why? And the orthodoxy has always said, well, what they need is more therapy. They've gotten more mental health intervention than any generation. They've had more therapy. Only 40% have been in therapy. They've had more psychiatric medication. They've had more diagnosis than any other generation. But what would they need is more. They just haven't gotten enough. So my book takes a look and says, wait a second. We know that, this is what researchers have called the treatment prevalent paradox around depression. We know that with any good treatment that becomes more prevalent, more widely accessible and available, point prevalence rates for any malady should be going down, right? We saw this with breast cancer treatment and screening, that deaths, as treatment improved, deaths from breast cancer went down. And it should be, we should see these young people as the picture of mental health. After all, they're getting more treatment. But instead, as I argue in the book, a lot of the treatment has actually been counterproductive. In fact, that the kids are getting the kinds of therapy they're getting and the kinds of interventions are often too much They're often inappropriate. They're often overdiagnosed, overmedicated. And what we're seeing are some of the known psychiatric effects and psychological effects, and you see this in the research, of therapy, because therapy can come with side effects. And here's the key, especially preventive mental health intervention. See, when you're actually dealing with a serious problem, that tends to focus the mind and sort of laser, outline the solution. It tends to pinpoint things. But when you sit a teen who's just bummed out into therapy without any sense of where you're going or what the problem is, there a lot of the side effects of therapy can come in, and I think we're seeing that.
How many teenagers and kids in the United States are actually in therapy? All right. Because it seemed to me sometimes like maybe it's just like a very particular group of people, like usually like privileged people, right? That end up getting maybe lots of therapy that they don't need.
Right. It's a brilliant question. It's an important one. So am I just talking about a rich kids problem? They're the Upper West Side, though they're all throwing their kids into therapy, but the rest of America isn't. Well, when I started the book, I thought that the problem, I had a different hypothesis that I sold to the publisher, which was that it had something to do with the way kids were being raised today by their parents. But then when I started going into the mental health interventions to see what we were doing to help kids, I started realizing that we were really dumping therapy into the drinking water, by which I mean, look, nearly 40% of the rising generation says it's been in therapy. And I think the number is higher now, has been in some kind of therapy. And the reason I think it's even higher is because we're seeing extraordinarily high rates of kids responding that they've had a diagnosis. So somebody is diagnosing huge numbers of these kids. When you look at the different diagnoses, these vary, but as early as 2016, 1 in 6 American kids between the ages of 2 and 8 already had a mental health or behavioral diagnosis. So you're seeing these extraordinarily high rates of diagnosis. But you also, when you go into the schools, and this is public school, you see that not only have mental health staffs expanded in the last 15 years greatly, but they're all doing this sort of social emotional learning, which looks a lot like group therapy. It's kids sitting around talking about how they would handle various kinds of sadness, disappointment, struggle, and reflecting on their own. You saw that in the last generation, certainly all the best-selling parenting books, or great many of them, were written by therapists. And they sort of instruct parents in becoming like, proxy therapists. And so I started realizing, look, some of this was from actual therapists, but a lot of people were behaving like therapists with our kids and introducing similar concepts of affirming the kids' feelings, never being judgmental, meeting a kid where they are, which means at eye level, never asserting their own authority, but just trying to understand every bit of, bad behavior as a cry for emotional help. And once I realized everyone seemed to be behaving like a therapist with the kids, I realized that the problem was much broader than parents. And it seemed to be that mental health so-called experts were really calling the shots, and all sorts of people from teachers to parents were really being to pediatricians were really being guided by the mental health industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the really crucial. Like, even if you're not, and you're of a less privileged background, but you're in a public school context, you have a whole sort of public school system now. Yes, and in conjunction with pediatrics, that is certainly for boys, very quick to label ADHD, very quick to prescribe Ritalin or Adderall. And those are, you can actually look at those numbers as just the hockey stick of that. So that's kind of observable, even whether or not someone's in a talk therapy regime, right?
Yeah, and we were losing something in the process too, right? Every adult who had so-called undiagnosed ADHD was now saying, I probably had ADHD and it was never diagnosed. And no one was mentioning the fact that those adults sometimes were wildly successful as undiagnosed ADHD adults, right? So in many cases, it hadn't necessarily clearly hurt them to not be diagnosed. Nonetheless, we were letting kindergarten teachers decide that their 5-year-old boy really should be screened for ADHD. And I was talking to parents who were saying, one year a teacher said he had ADHD, and then the next year nobody said a word. He was suddenly a great student, and part of it was a different teacher. And going in and putting a kid, and I'm not saying nobody has ADHD, of course, but putting a kid on a dramatically personality, altering drug. And here's the kicker, a kid, meaning someone whose entire being is necessarily in flux, was a way more serious intervention than I think we were treating it like. Rather than having our default be, well, let's see how he is. Let's make some changes in the environment and see how he does. The default was a good, responsible parent immediately gets the diagnosis and proceeds with medication.
This question of does a diagnosis help or hinder is such an interesting one. My partner has ADHD, and I think that he would very much so agree with you that, like, he always says, I hate it when people use their ADHD as a crutch, right? Like, it's anathema to him, On the other hand, how I grew up was there was a lot of undiagnosed mental illness around me. And when the mental illness was finally diagnosed, it was a huge relief. That wasn't me, other people. There's a way for people to be therapized or treated or healed. Like, some people really do need medication. I'm not necessarily talking about a 5-year-old, but sometimes there really are things that need to be treated. So, how do we, I guess, make sure that when something needs to be treated, it is being treated, but we don't end up treating people that it's not necessary to be treated?
Well, the most important thing is that the bar should be much higher for children. And the reason the bar should be higher for children, and I don't think it is, the adults get in there, they sort of all agree that this is necessary, and they go, go, go. And here's the problem. You don't have anyone who can say, hold on a second. I remember how things were before the medication. I don't think this is right. I don't think this is working. I think I need an adjustment. You've taken the person out of the equation because it's a child or adolescent. And with an adult, it's so much safer to go ahead and give a medication a shot because they can tell you how they used to feel. And they can tell you, you know what? I don't have a sex drive now, and I don't like that. They can tell you, I'm really overeating. I'm concerned about that. I've put on a lot of weight. But it's much harder for a teenager to evaluate those things because, of course, a young person is changing so rapidly. They're just developing a sex drive and getting a handle on it. So the number one most important thing is that it should be a higher bar for kids. And I don't think that it is. Right? It's just too easy for adults to sit around and all agree that the child needs medication without the young person having a meaningful part in the discussion because they can't. They really can't. An adult can say, look, a decade ago, I was doing much better and I wasn't on this medication and I think I can get back there. Anyway, but there's something else too. A person who gets a diagnosis will always feel relief, almost always feel relief. That is not proof that the diagnosis is accurate or that the medication is helping. And very often what it's doing is it's taking responsibility off the person. And we might want to do that for an adult for various reasons. And we might be willing to let that, err on the side of overdiagnosis with adult. But you don't want to take away, efficacy or responsibility or agency from a child who is just developing a sense of, wait a second, I was being lazy. If I'm being honest, I could have worked harder. If I'm being honest, I could have taken my math test. I kind of exaggerated. You don't want to relieve a kid of that responsibility unless you have to. Unless the problem is pronounced enough, you can say, look, I've been their parent. I can tell you the struggles with math are really serious or whatever it is. We need to do something.
Yeah, this sort of gets this contemporary, particularly in the Western affluent world, fear-based parenting on the one hand, and I will protect my child from all harm / pain / difficulty on the other. And, Jonathan Haidt certainly talks about that too, separate from the social media factor, right? The free-range child versus unless you're wearing a Kevlar suit and are put in an armored vehicle, you shouldn't be allowed to go to school or be in a playground. And I think there's an element of that too, in that there's been certainly a widespread sense of any harm is to be avoided, but unfortunately at significant cost, and that's been somewhat lost. So there's the parenting part of that that's very deep of like, and then there's the social reinforcement of that. Like, if you don't do that, you're a bad parent. You're not being considerate. Like, how do you interact with those realities?
I think that's right. We ended up with this fear-based parenting. And so I asked why. I wanted to know, why did parents, and what were they worried about? And it struck me that what they were worried about was not physical harm principally any longer. It was emotional harm. One of the things that was driving parents was this terror of emotional harm, this terror of a kid ever feeling unsupported, that was now playing a bigger role. And that's why we needed to track kids. We needed to be around, an adult had to be hovering around them at all times. Why? Because someone could call them a bad name. Someone out of earshot could call them ugly, fat, stupid, whatever, and they would be marked for life. And that was the worry. It's not true, right? We've all been called bad names, and kids need to learn to survive those things. Why? Because they'll be called bad names again. As I'm sure you've had the experience of being, criticized for, and things you've done. Being able to weather a certain amount of criticism is absolutely just a part of adulthood, because you will get it, right, in any job. And shielding kids. I mean, we were worried that if anyone ever touched them in any way that was unwanted or whatever, that would be permanent. They would now permanently live with that trauma. And first of all, it wasn't true. But second of all, I think that the mental health, I know that the mental health industry played a big role in scaring the hell out of parents. And I think it was a huge overstep, and it wasn't true. People actually are incredibly resilient, which doesn't mean you want your kids called bad names, and it doesn't mean you want your kids bullied, and it certainly doesn't mean you want them touched, in ways that they don't want, or too aggressively, or knocked around, or any of the other stuff. But it wasn't true that it would mark them for life, or that they would walk around with this now, emotional disability in effect. That wasn't true. And we know this because there's been really great research on all kinds of things happening to kids, and them and as adults putting it behind them, or even, in childhood, being resilient to all kinds of pain, from the loss of a parent, the loss of a sibling, even to certain kinds of abuse. People can get past them. And so not that any of that, we don't, of course, we want to protect our kids from the, extreme instances of those things, things that go beyond just teasing. But the question is it going to mark them for life? Are they permanently damaged? And the answer to that for most things is no.
So I'm really curious if you're able to detail a pathway from the concept of trauma, like you might call big T trauma, to like little T trauma, which is what you're just talking about, right? I've been to trauma therapy. I know people have gone to therapy for like very serious stuff, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Like I'm not talking about like your parents were mean to you one time. It was very helpful. None of the therapists were encouraging them to sit around and wallow in stupid stuff. They're trying to get you to get past it, right? Like they want you to thrive and be resilient, like you're describing. But on the other hand, there certainly are those cases. Like I've talked to people where, again, they come from incredibly privileged backgrounds. They go to trauma therapy. All of a sudden, they're talking about how like a vacation with grandma was a traumatic moment. And you're like, how did we get here? So that's my question to you. Like, how did we get there? Because in my experience, there are a lot of very good trauma therapists out there. And if you read some of the trauma books, like what they're really talking about is like PTSD, rape victims in war, severe beatings as a kid. And I just don't know how we kind of jumped the shark a little bit here.
Oh, how we jumped the shark? Well, I think we jumped the shark with the expansion of mental health experts, with the expansion of trauma gurus, right? I talk to neuropsychologists, neurobiologists on this. You can't really generalize from combat experiences and severe, instances of, rape and violence to feeling left out. And yet trauma therapists do this all the time, right? If you read the books, they're always saying, and now we can look at a kid who was neglected because they were in a very unsupportive home, or mom was working 2 jobs and never around. And by the way, therapeutic popularizers do this all the time. You just look at them on Instagram, and they're always generalizing. And also they're reasoning backwards. If you have this psychopathology as an adult, you must have been experienced this as a child. And then comes a revelation. Oh, yes, I was. Right? It's never falsifiable. It's not particularly rigorous. And here's the kicker. People are very bad judges of knowing if something's working. Why? Because when they first hear that it's not their fault, their divorce is not their fault, they're getting fired isn't their fault, they feel that's it. It's because of my bipolar disorder. It's because of my trauma. And they will always feel like, wow, that was so great that now I know, right? Now, that doesn't mean that's never true. Of course, there are instances when it is true, right? Where people have gone through, these sudden shocks to the system that can produce PTSD. By the way, not every combat vet gets PTSD. It's still a small minority because actually we are built for resilience, which doesn't make those experiences pleasant or not, easy. But actually, most combat vets left alone will not get PTSD, which is remarkable. It's remarkable. And we're not telling people that. We're not telling them that the number of women my age who have experienced unwanted sexual advance, is it 100%? It's very high, right? And it's just the idea of telling people that that is traumatic and you have PTSD from that is often untrue. We know it's of course, it's going to be in the treatment provider's interest to keep you coming back, which doesn't mean it's conscious. But is it an accurate diagnosis? In most cases, it isn't.
It's funny. I mean, you could also turn that on its head without getting too into therapy land, that whether or not the spectrum of big T trauma and small T trauma is highly subjective, that most people experience some form of trauma in their lives, but that the end outcome of all of it is, okay, how am I going to live and what am I going to do about that? And how am I going to live in a way that is both resilient and whole and not eternally captive to that experience? Meaning, you could actually accept that there may be a much wider trauma envelope than we have hitherto in our human experience allowed for, maybe because we have the time and freedom to do so, meaning the elemental needs of food, clothing, shelter, security have largely been removed from our daily equation, more or less. And that gives us a lot more time to navel gaze, if you want to say it pejoratively, or know ourselves, if you want to say it more embracively. Either way, it doesn't necessarily matter if the goal is to not live with kind of a trauma jacket that you carry with you forever. So it doesn't necessarily matter whether your trauma is, I had a crappy vacation with grandma, or I was, chained up in a room. The healing and the moving on is still the goal in any case, right?
So this is the question. What if a lot of it's just metaphor? It's just harmless metaphor. I call it trauma. I don't mean that I actually have PTSD. I'm just sort of jocularly referring. Here's the problem. The rising generation is using it as an excuse to opt out of life. They seem to be utterly literal about their PTSD. That's the problem. If it was all adults sitting around with wine, talking about their bad experiences and the trauma and whatever, and they were moving on and leading productive lives, I wouldn't have written the book. Because who cares? Really, who cares? Right? That's how I feel. But when you have young people who say, oh no, my parents made me move. And that's why, insert deterministic answer here. My parents made me lose. I lost my friends in middle school. And that was my trauma. And because of that.
So I can no longer form lasting relationships.
Right.
And whatever.
And you're seeing that, and it's tragic because it's not true. And it's giving them the excuse and in some cases, the mandate to get out of hard things that will make them stronger and happier. Like, going for that job they now don't feel up for, even showing up to work. We have generation that is not reliable. Employers will say, or they're not reliable. They don't show up. These are employers who want to hire these people's parents rather than them. We used to love hiring the next generation. They were hardworking. They would do anything to succeed. They had endless energy. Their brains were sharper. Now employers want to hire their parents. And that's a tragedy. That really is something that needs to be fixed, at least, because they have all the potential. They have all the, they have everything in front of them. We don't want them opting out. But they have become awfully literal about these diagnoses that many people seem to be using as metaphor.
Can I ask you both, since you both have kids, right? Is this something you've seen in your kids and your kids' cohort? Because I don't have kids. So sometimes when I hear this stuff, I'm thinking to myself, like, they used to say that about millennials too, right? When millennials entered the workforce, I remember it very well. Like, people were like, "Oh, millennials, they don't want to do this, they don't want to do that." And like, I don't know, we turned out okay. So yeah, I'm just curious about your both your personal experience.
I think millennials turn out amazing in a lot of ways. I mean, whatever you think about your subjective feeling about millennial, I'm the tail end of Gen X. I'm not a millennial. But whatever your subjective feelings about them, I wouldn't have written this book about millennials. And the reason is, first of all, the biggest difference is they have an internal locus of control. They report feeling like they have the power to make a positive change in their lives. And one of the most disturbing things about the rising generation is in numbers we've never before seen. They respond to surveys that they don't believe they have a capacity to make a positive difference in their own lives. That's a problem.
It's interesting historically that there were these moments of which the Salem witch trial was certainly one of the most dramatic, but there have been at times like weird suicide clusters, like where particularly young people and teenagers seem to simultaneously go, well, what we would have used to have said go crazy simultaneously. I know that that's completely on PC to use that. I apologize to people listening if you find that insensitive. It's simply a shorthand for there are periods of time that we know historically where it's almost like a storm or a disease, just like descends simultaneously on a cohort of people and then goes away, right? That's also the weird thing about it. And at times I wondered whether we're in one of these moments, but it's now so amplified by channels of social media. And then, as you say, an industry, which also never existed before, that there's no passing. Like these things used to descend and then like dissipate. And there seems to be no dissipation. But I do think there's something very human about these kind of odd moments.
Yeah, I think that social contagion is real and that we are we are creatures who tend to take on each other's pain in various degrees. And I think that if young people's deciding that they had PTSD were accompanied with, and now I'm going to do the following, I'm going to exercise every day, I'm going to go whatever, then I'm going to make sure I'm surrounded by community, then you would say, okay, it's harmless. But actually, we're hearing more and more of these people saying, I mean, think about this, you'll have people who say they were in therapy for 10 years. Well, was that 10 years of progress? Maybe, but there seems to be a lot of going around in circles, right? And for an adult, my general attitude is who cares? Who cares if you're not making progress in therapy, that's your business. Maybe you just like it. But with kids, it's a big problem. It really is. It's a big problem if kids feel that now I have a diagnosis. Now I can't take any risks without checking in with this adult or this expert. I need my medication adjusted. I can't do it on my own. And this is the I can't do it generation. And that's just a massive problem for any country. It's a massive problem for ours, but it's also just really troubling because the truth is they can do it. They really can. There's so much they can do. They can take that test. Many of them don't need that accommodation. It's not helping. And there are all these, one of the things I looked at the book is there are all these people who seem to be or are posing as the helpers who are not helping. They're being counterproductive. And one example is I talk about the school counselor. Well, what is the school counselor's only leverage? Like, what can they do? They can get a child out of their responsibilities in school. That's the main, tool that they have in school. But we don't want kids avoiding every test. Unless there's a severe problem, of course. You don't, force a kid who's dyslexic necessarily to complete things in the same time as someone else, whatever. But aside from that, a kid who just has testing anxiety, we know that facing the thing that's causing anxiety is the best thing for the kid. But starting with, how many professions require regular testing? Or is it true that they're going to get untimed for the rest of their lives? So pushing them a little is often better than getting them out of that responsibility. Nonetheless, we've got this whole apparatus where the only tool they've got is to excuse these kids from tests or, whatever the assignment is.
Which also, by the way, does engender a degree of cynicism and frustration amongst a whole other set of people who don't get the accommodations, who view some of that with real skepticism. They're like, oh, come on, Johnny didn't need 2 hours and like he got it, but he didn't need it. But maybe I should find a way to get it too if it's going to help me. And if I'm going to be disadvantaged by not getting it, then maybe I should find a way to, get that accommodation too. And if you think that doesn't go on, I mean, that goes on a lot. Like that's a sort of a ancillary issue to what you're talking about, but it affects everything else.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't remember what the numbers were, but I heard, and my boys are just going to be starting high school in the fall, and I heard the numbers of kids who have some sort of testing accommodation, and the percentages was so high, it doesn't really make any sense. Now, that of course, doesn't mean that it's never appropriate. But let me just say, if that were in the best interest of kids, if kids were being helped by it, and I didn't think they would be harmed by it, I would say, okay, well, I guess, some kids are just going to need to study harder or whatever you say. It's not particularly fair, but it's not the end of the world. The problem is that once you tell a young person, no, you have a brain problem, they often take that awfully seriously. We're seeing them put it in their social media bios. They see it as a limiting factor for the rest of their lives. And an adult can say, I probably had ADHD that's undiagnosed, and he's got this whole career to look back on, and you can tell it doesn't really affect him. But a young person who's just starting out might always think, I can't because of my ADHD. I need my Adderall for that. And that's a much worse position to be in as a young person, especially when it's not necessary.
So I asked the same question to Jonathan Haidt. I'm going to repeat it to you. Do you think the poll is going to swing back in the other direction? Meaning that I think some of the parents as therapists trend came from people not wanting to repeat the parenting that they had, right? Like I'm not saying they were traumatized necessarily, but they didn't feel like it really did them a whole lot of favors, I guess. So they tried something else with their kids. Gen Z now, having grown up in that way, I mean, do they feel satisfied with this and they're going to repeat it on their kids? Or do we think that they're like, yeah, no, we see that this is not the way. Let's try something new.
I love that question, and it's important. And I think the answer is, possibly yes. We know that a lot of this gentle parenting went too far. Look, with trends and fads, they tend to swing back where you don't have an entrenched group fighting. Sometimes they do just switch back. And I think people are waking up to the idea of the dramatic over application of words like trauma and diagnosis and whatever. But here's the problem. The problem is we do have this entrenched group, which really does have the incentive. Therapy, unlike medicine, where you really are always evaluating, or ideally in most instances, you're really evaluating, did the rash go away? Am I still sneezing? Am I still coughing? We have these external measures. It's much harder to measure if therapy is working. And there have been these studies showing that people tend to feel purged after therapy, regardless of whether it's actually helping the underlying problem. So they tend to, our own feelings of that felt great. Therapy is helping. Oh gosh, 10 years just slipped by and I have the same problems. They tend not to notice that. And the problem is biggest with kids. And we do have this, ever expanding. I mean, they're demanding, I think as an industry, they're demanding more and more resources. They want more and more expanded interventions in schools. By the way, when you look at the empirics on these interventions in schools, they're not impressive, to put it mildly. But nonetheless, they're demanding more and more. So there's a lot more feelings focused on this generation, a lot more talk on their pain. And I do think it's very, very counterproductive. It is a way of sort of disabling kids' resources for overcoming, their own distress or discomfort. And I do think I hope we can see some response to it or pushback. And I'm optimistic that there can be, but we need sort of a concerted effort.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I think is very human, but also quite unhelpful, is this narrative of a crisis that has never before been X, right? Whether it's teen depression, teen suicidal ideation, teen, feelings of loneliness, disconnect, all of it, without the awareness of until we created a category of teenagers, which in the greater scheme of things is recent in and of itself. Even the category of childhood, right? I mean, there have been great historians who kind of look at childhood as not a category that you think it is, right? No one ever asked these questions, right? We don't know what the mental health was of a cohort of young people and teenagers in 1880, because it didn't even occur to human beings that this was a thing that you should investigate, right? I mean, it's a really recent idea that we have this inner life that is nascent and developing that requires kind of attending, and in the same way that you do like diet and exercise, all of which are also newer things, right? Nobody was hitting the gym in 1914. It wasn't a thing. No one like so I'm just also struck by that. Like we think we know what the resting state of human beings is. And maybe we're learning what the resting state of human beings is, which is chaotic and non-generalizable and messy and confusing and beautiful and ugly and horrific and terrible and magnificent and wonderful and all the above, all at the same time, much within the same person. I don't know what my question is in that, but these things palpably come to me when I read your book and I listen to these, because there seems to be a lack of humility of we're just figuring out what we are internally. Like this has not been a huge element of societal pursuits until very recently.
That's exactly right. And here's the thing that I think we've lost: the sense that we can ever ignore any of it. We can ignore it. There are things you can ignore, right? We don't have to be in the state with kids where we're constantly attending to every emotional, just every bit of distress. And here's why it's so important. Look, an adult who grew up in an earlier era and maybe more repressive one and wants to, unearth some things or revisit them things, that's one thing. But a child and an adolescent, these are very emotionally volatile young people, right? And if we never tell them, you can just put that behind you and get on with school, they might never know that they can. And we're seeing these kids who are so dysregulated showing up to school, so frantic about every one of their emotions, right? That they don't even know they could ignore a certain amount of that. And now, as young adults, they're unable to, right? They've always been told repression is always bad. Repression is how you get through a job, right? It's how you show up for work. Because you know what? There are plenty of days when none of us feel like working. And yet we do, you know? And you can't raise kids with no sense, because they've been treated like, by therapists or therapeutic proxies at every turn, who've dealt with every possible, manifestation of distress. You raise a kid where every feeling they think is front and center, and lo and behold, they can't put their feelings ever to one side. And that's a problem too.
I know that we're talking about kids and that's the premise of the book, but I couldn't help wondering as, I was reading the book and as we're having this conversation, do you think therapy is beneficial for adults?
Absolutely. And the question is when and what kind. Now, first of all, I think that there are iatrogenic effects of therapy. They're known, that's just, there's a great body of research on that. And I think as a profession, they're not as upfront about them as they should be. I mean, some of the best therapists and psychologists, typically academic psychologists, they're well aware of them and they'll talk about them. But a lot of the practitioners won't. And they get very offended if you bring that up. Well, of course, there are side effects to any helpful, efficacious intervention. And we should be able to talk about the side effects, the known side effects of therapy, like my depression got worse, like my anxiety got worse. People don't even know that that can happen. Now, the best, in my view, the best clinical therapists are people who, are aware of those and even are willing to talk about them with their patients and have some sense of whether they're getting worse, right? Therapy is at its best when it's dealing with an actual problem, right? Something getting in the way of your functioning of normal life, right? So if you have any number of anything from anorexia to obsessive compulsive disorder, any problem that's really getting in the way of your functioning, I think therapy can be very helpful. And there's good study, there's good evidence of that. But I think sitting around with a therapist, especially for a teenager, where it's undefined in scope, where the problem is sort of amorphous, that comes with a lot of risk. And it can be beneficial, but it can also introduce risk, like alienation from mom and dad, like, increased depression, like over reliance on the therapist. And the problem is that I think as a profession, they're not as upfront that those are risks. Before you start therapy, you should know here are some of the known side effects. We don't do that with therapy, but we should.
So two questions, one very broad and one very specific. And we'll start with the specific one first. I want to ask you about drugs because it struck me in reading the book, and this has also been something I've been focused on for years, that we prescribe these very powerful drugs to kids to treat something, an issue, a problem internally. And then we categorize another set of drugs as like the most dangerous, harmful potential substances in the world. So we basically said, here's one set of very powerful drugs that we're going to tell you to take, and here's another powerful set of drugs that we're going to tell you to avoid at all costs. Do you think that part of the problem of whatever our issues around illegal substances is that we're so busy prescribing so many legal substances that whose effects are just as powerful?
That's a great point. I think absolutely. Absolutely. We are so honestly, I think we are so quick to introduce things like Adderall and Ritalin. And these are profound, habit forming drugs potentially. I mean, these are not nothing. And then we say, oh no, those other drugs, those are the bad ones. And I think that's very confusing to a teenager who's learned to feel like to rely on a drug feels like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is so much harder than, leaving my phone off and sitting down and doing my homework, which is really frustrating, right? And wow, look, without, and becoming reliant on them. It's very confusing for kids. And look, let's be honest, I think they have a lot of the same pitfalls, right? The pitfall is if you're using a drug to get out of something you should face and you can face, that's going to be that, and it feels great to take. That really has a high likelihood of being habit forming. And we're seeing all these kids addicted to Adderall. Why? Because they learned they were to do it young. It produced an immediate great response, right? It made them feel great. Now they never want to get off it. And that's a lot of the same stuff we're worried about with any drug.
So the big picture question as we end is, have you found that in the response to this book, and you did an earlier book that was also, controversial in its way about transgender issues, have you felt more heartened at what Emma just talked about, that there may be a inflection point or, peak therapy, peak bad therapy, or has the tumult that the book has created made you feel like we're still really deeply mired in this? Meaning your own experience of the effect of your own argument on a direction that you hope society takes.
I'm very optimistic about this issue. The earlier book, I got so much backlash. This one, I thought there was a possibility I would get backlash, but that's not what I'm getting. The overwhelming response has been relief, and not just by parents, although it's clear from parents, but also by practitioners. The number of people in the psychiatric and psychological field who have reached out and said, thank you for writing this book. This has gone so far overboard in my own field. And that's been very heartening. And so I think this absolutely that we can sort of reset the default settings. And that's the only thing I ever wanted to do was when I looked at this, my overall, sort of where I ended up is we need to change the default. And the default is don't introduce these things unless you absolutely need them. That really should have been our default with kids and adolescents. And I'm very hopeful about that. And one of the funny things that turned out is I was very early with the first book in terms of the social contagion of the transgender identity among teenage girls. And I think a lot of the resistance was that I sort of saw a lot of the problems that hadn't yet made it through the culture. And so there was a lot of resistance. With this book, I think there really has been this dawning that awareness that really is too much. It really is too much feelings focus. It's too much diagnosis. It's too much psych med. And so I'm very heartened that I seem to have hit on something that people are themselves coming to on their own.
I know that not everyone's going to agree, but it is absolutely wonderful that you've created the space to have these conversations, which orthodoxies tend to try to shut down. I mean, I think the most important thing is to examine, are we doing the right thing? Is this the way we should be raising our children? Is this the way we should be functioning in our society? Like, what's the right thing? And you've done a great service to us all by opening up the space of that conversation and making people question and ask. is this working?
Thank you. That's exactly what I hope to do. And if I even got the conversation going, then I feel really great about that. So thank you for having me on your show to have that conversation. It was wonderful.
Thanks so much, Abigail.
So I personally wouldn't be so troubled by some of this were it not accompanied by the drug regimens, and particularly the binary that's created between these drugs are powerful. We're going to prescribe them early and often, and we're even going to tell parents they have to give their kids these drugs or their kid will be taken out and put into a different program. I mean, there's a coercive element of you have to prescribe these drugs. And then we go about and this is the conversation we had at the end with Abigail. We make all these other drugs, quote unquote, illegal that are equally powerful. And we completely mix the signals of what are these substances? What are they for? Are they helpful? Are they harmful? But the medicating of kids, which has clearly increased immeasurably over the past 10 to 20 years. I mean, I don't think that's debatable, right? Because we can see that. I find a very troubling aspect to all this, far more than if you just told a bunch of kids they had to go to therapy.
Yeah, no, I agree with you wholeheartedly about that point. I always said too, if I ever have kids, like I'm not going to put them on a drug. Like that would be the very, very last step. Those things aren't even proven to work in adults sometimes.
Right.
So,
And by the way, I mean, I'm not saying this with any critique of parents who do this. I mean, often there's a lot of social pressure to do this. They're being told this will be helpful and are doing so based on the inputs they have, which are limited, but from experts that they feel have their kids' best interest at heart.
yeah, we'll see what happens next, right? The retraction of things, what ends up happening out there in the real world in schools and therapy and so on.
Absolutely. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Send us your comments, particularly on this issue. If you've got stories that illuminate this one way or the other, we would be fascinated to hear them. And Emma, I'm sure, can then highlight them if that is worth doing in a newsletter or a subsequent conversation. So we will be back with you next week.
Thanks, everybody.